Welcome to Decision 2020, the U.S. House of Representatives Candidate Forum. This is an opportunity for voters to hear directly from the candidates. Today, we turn our attention to the U.S. House of Representatives race in Michigan's 3rd Congressional District, where Democrat Hillary Scholten and Republican Peter Meijer are the only candidates in the race filling the seat held by independent Justin Amash. Today's forum was recorded Monday, October 5th from the studios of the Meijer Public Broadcast Center at Grand Valley State University. Now, let us begin by introducing Republican candidate Peter Meijer from Grand Rapids. Peter, thank you so much for joining us.
Patrick, it's a pleasure to be back on. Thank you so much.
All right, this is a wide open race here. The polling is very close. Let's begin with you just telling us a little bit about yourself and why it is that you want to serve in Congress.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me on. I'm a 4th generation, proud West Michigander, and this notion of service, of both military service when I served our country in Iraq, of humanitarian aid service. Actually, the last time we spoke was talking about that in Team Rubicon, the disaster response organization, of going to continue to serve in the humanitarian aid community in Afghanistan, of working to serve my fellow veterans who are coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan with veteran educational benefits, and now looking to serve once more as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives representing West Michigan. So I think this is a district that sent strong, stable, and effective leaders like Gerald R. Ford, like Paul Henry, like Vern Ehlers, who've gone to Washington to make sure that we had a strong voice looking out for us in D.C., but also being able to bring some strength and some stability to the times we're in, while at the same time looking forward at the challenges to come. And I think especially in the era of COVID, we obviously need to get past the pandemic. We need to make sure that we're working on a cure. We need to make sure we get the vaccine out. We need to make sure that we're supporting our businesses in the interim. But we also have to remember that once we're through this point, we're going to need to make sure that our government functions better. We need to make sure we're addressing those longer term issues like the affordability of healthcare, like tackling our climate crisis. These are issues that we've had that have been on the back burner. Ever since COVID kind of came down, but we need leaders in Congress who are going to be ready to kind of bite the bullet and finally make some progress in these long-term concerns. And I'm running for Congress to make sure we have leadership that does exactly that.
We touched on a couple of issues that we're going to be getting to. The big one, of course, is the pandemic. Under normal circumstances, you would be here with me on the set, but we're social distancing. So the coronavirus pandemic, a public health crisis killing more than 200,000 Americans so far this year. It's impacting the economy, education, society at large. In Congress, what steps would you promote stemming the spread of the disease and supporting the economy and our schools?
Yeah, obviously the first thing that we need to do, to your point, is to slow the spread of the disease. That's something that's obviously been a challenge from the very beginning, and there'll be some, kind of tough questions to ask in terms of how prepared our federal government was, what the CDC and the FDA could have done better, especially around not only disease surveillance and prevention in the beginning, but also around testing and delegating down testing rather than kind of creating bottlenecks at the federal level. Right now we have Operation Warp Speed that is, right on the verge of vaccine development. I think there's 3 different vaccines currently in their phase 3 trials. So that's kind of the most operative point. And until we get there, continuing a lot of the state level efforts we've had to slow the spread. But again, those have to be a little bit more tailored to what concerns and what the realities are on the ground within certain localities. To get us between here and there on the economic side, continuing a stimulus package that we've already seen. I've said before, I'm a much bigger proponent of direct cash payments to folks rather than some of the convoluted ways that we've structured them in the past, and then continuing programs to give liquidity to especially small and medium-sized businesses through, extensions of the Paycheck Protection Program. Again, it's going to be a patchwork. There's not one silver bullet here, and a lot of this is just continuing to give folks a period to kind of make it through the next pay period, make it through the next rent payment, so that once we are able to get back to normal, we've had as minimal an economic consequence as possible. But again, our job isn't done when we're through this pandemic, because we need to make sure that we are holding our government's feet to the fire, holding folks accountable, and making sure that we are building a more resilient, responsive, and adaptive government rather than the centralization of power that's just led to a very rickety and inefficient government all too often.
You mentioned things getting back to normal. Right now, the pandemic impacting everyone's activities. What action should be taken ensuring the presidential election is free, fair, and secure?
Yeah. Well, we're seeing a lot of those actions already being taken. Obviously, with an increase in, and these are two terms that are used a little bit interchangeably between absentee voting and mail-in voting. We've seen some, I would say, loosening in some places, some of which is very necessary. I'm firmly supportive of no reason absentee voting. I think we just need to be careful where we had done away with things like the first time that you had voted in a jurisdiction. In Michigan, this was the pre-2018 rule. If you wanted to vote absentee, you had to at least have voted in person once or go into the clerk's office once so you could have that physical affirmation. That's something where I think I understand the needs to have the clerks take a little bit of a step back and not have that in-person contact, but it's just something we need to watch very closely. But again, making sure that we are notifying folks that they're aware of the various deadlines and limits if they choose to vote absentee, and also informing folks, how to vote absentee properly. We've had that issue. I think we have a better cure process in Michigan than other states, but if someone hasn't voted absentee before, where you need to sign, the use of the secrecy envelope, these are steps that I think we need to ensure folks are well versed in and make it as clear as possible, so that if someone intends to cast a vote, that vote is received and counted, as it should be, but while ensuring every step to ensure the integrity of free and fair elections.
You mentioned healthcare in your introduction. The Affordable Care Act has been long debated. What is the correct course for providing Americans with healthcare? Do you believe people with pre-existing conditions should be protected?
I absolutely believe that people with pre-existing conditions should be protected. I think it was one of two things that the Affordable Care Act got right, with protections for pre-existing conditions, but also with helping expand access so that folks who weren't on an employer-based plan had a better way to buy in and get health insurance. My bigger frustration has been the way that the Affordable Care Act failed to live up to that first word in its title, which is affordable. Again, if there's one overwhelming trend in this country, it's that the more you centralize, the more you raise to the highest level a program, the less accountability there is, the less incentive there is to compete on price. Companies right now are profiting off the Affordable Care Act, not because they're offering a better service, not because they're offering better value or higher quality. They profit off of locking in a government revenue stream. Insurance companies, medical device manufacturers, hospital systems, just about anyone who was in operation before the Affordable Care Act has seen their profits continue to grow. But we've, as a people, have seen our premiums continue to rise as well. That is my fundamental frustration, where I think the arguments that not wanting to have the Affordable Care Act be the law of the land and wanting to find a better replacement is tantamount with wanting to deny coverage to folks with pre-existing conditions is misleading at best and an outright lie at worst. The system that we have is not functioning well. I would not be supportive of a repeal of Obamacare without a comprehensive and workable replacement in mind. And then I realize it's up to my party, it's up to the Republican Party to build voters' confidence in that. But the best way we get towards that area is to increase what ultimately drives down costs, to increase transparency, to increase competition, to make sure that, again, those companies are profiting off of the right incentives, which is higher quality, lower cost, better value, and not just winning a government contract. Because if we don't do that, then we'll never actually see a moment where folks can achieve affordable health care.
President Donald Trump has made it a point to renegotiate trade deals. Some of the negotiating tactics include enacting tariffs. In your opinion, is the overall plan working? What job creation strategy or strategies do you support?
Yeah, I'm definitely a free markets kind of guy, but I am very open to the use of tariffs, again, as a tactic, as a way to gain a better negotiating position and show our economic partners that we mean business, and we're no longer going to stand by and let unfair trade practices on their behalf go unanswered. Again, I do not want us to get to a point where tariffs become the strategy, but rather where they can build a more level playing field. Specifically with China, we've seen, for the past 2 decades, just a litany of unfair trade practices that American companies have had to absorb, whether that's intellectual property theft valued in the trillions of dollars, whether that is Chinese subsidization through their state-owned lending facilities so that less competitive Chinese companies had an advantage against American companies that were accountable to the market, whether it was devaluation of their currency. I'm strongly supportive of making sure we use the full array of American resources so that our companies aren't being held at a disadvantage. Continuing to seek out opportunities where we can kind of lower those barriers, where folks are willing to de-escalate and engage in kind of free and more fair practices. I mean, that's something I'm fully supportive of. It's obviously going to be a different scenario if you're talking with China or you're talking with European Union countries or Latin American trading partners. But I think we've seen tremendous gains with the USMCA, just getting back to a point where, and frankly, the renegotiation of NAFTA is a great example of that. Something that was developed 2.5 decades ago and was not meant to be forever. We should be coming up to renew and reevaluate what works for today. I'm a firm believer in sunset clauses and making sure that we have a government that isn't just operating on autopilot off of legislation that was put forward 25, 50, or 100 years ago without being reevaluated, and making sure that we have a government that's responsive to the needs of our country today and how the world is fixed today.
There's been upheaval across this nation this year, not only the pandemic, but we're seeing racial injustice, police brutality. How would you address these two issues?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it was the incidents of police brutality that prompted that more firm reevaluation on the racial justice side. But when you kind of scrape beneath that surface and try to decouple those layers, you have frustrations with economic opportunity, frustrations with educational opportunity, with historical underinvestment in some areas, with the legacy of mass incarceration and the need for criminal justice reform. I mean, a lot of these are, ironically, there are Republican policies that have already been put out, whether it was the First Step Act around criminal justice reform, whether it's the Opportunity Zone legislation to drive more investment and economic opportunities into especially minority neighborhoods that have been underinvested in since redlining policies in the 1930s, all the way up to school choice and the ability to seek out better educational outcomes. It's going to require a very full-throated solution, and it's going to take some time, but I think we need to be making every effort to work towards a more equitable, just, and inclusive society.
From cyber interference in democratic elections to the proliferation of nuclear weapons, what defense and national security measures are necessary for dealing with emboldened world leaders and terrorists targeting the United States?
I do really love that question. I would say that, again, I don't want to say a one-size-fits-all approach, because the way that we check, North Korean, lunacy versus how we counter, rising Chinese hegemony versus what we do to, hem in Iranian malign influence throughout the Middle East is going to be different. But one thing that I think is a commonality across all is we need to have long-term strategies and focus on where we need to go. I think one area where President Trump does not get enough credit has been on his foreign policy, and specifically not only showing the Iranians that we will engage in asymmetric and potentially disproportional in the small sense, but proportional in the widest sense type of responses, such as the killing of Qasem Soleimani, and just showing that the exportation of Iranian violence throughout the Middle East is not something we'll suffer lightly. But making sure that we, and then also with the Abraham Accords, and realizing that when it comes to Israel and the Gulf, there's a lot of new alliances that are forming that help promote stability in the long term. So beginning to kind of chunk out some of these issues so we can find areas of common ground. But more broadly, I think operating with the whole of government approach, making sure that our trade policy, our economic policy, our intelligence policy, our diplomacy, and our soft powers are operating in alignment rather than in isolation is going to be the best way to drive towards longer term results. I'm not a fan of wars of occupation or regime change wars. I think they increase our vulnerability. They don't promote our national security. They can oftentimes undermine it. But stronger investment in intelligence, stronger investment in diplomacy, and a renewed American sense of we need to have forward-looking foreign policy, not just dealing with the problems of today, but anticipating the challenges of tomorrow. That's what's going to get us there.
How will you deal with special interest groups influencing policy?
That's a tough one. Right now in this race, my Democratic opponent has 3-to-1 cash on hand to our campaign, has 4-to-1 dark money supporting her, over $1.2 million in dark money from the coast. So I'm feeling it very acutely. I think not on WGVU, but on just about every other station, you can see the negative ads starting to barrage. It's not an easy one. I think we need to appreciate the fact that, as we're seeing in an area where I'm proud that over 90% of our donors come from within Michigan, my opponent, less than 30% of her donors are in state, around 40% of donors are in state. There's a very ready way for cash to spread out into our political system and influence things in one way or the other. Finding reform mechanisms that are ultimately constitutional is a challenge, but it's an area where I'd love to work on, because I think the less transparency we have around the financing of our elections, just the worse off the American people become in terms of getting misleading or false information, or otherwise having the election decided by not who best represents the district and can talk to the most voters, but who has enough millionaires and billionaires back in their campaign to be able to determine an outcome.
You brought up climate change earlier for the over-the-air broadcast. Do you believe humans are significantly contributing to climate change?
Yes. I think the science is as close to solid on that as we can expect. And even if it's 90% and not 100, I'm the type of guy that likes to have the ounce of prevention rather than having to work on the other end with the pound of cure. Right? I mean, it is a reasonable measure to start to implement policies to decrease our carbon emissions, to decrease the emissions of other greenhouse gases, to promote the use of renewable energy, to try to just drive our country to a more sustainable place. I mean, the Republican Party is a conservative party, right? And to me, there's nothing more intrinsically conservative than conservation, taking a stewardship ethos, appreciating that what we've inherited isn't ours to just burn up and leave our children with nothing. It's ours to manage, to grow, and to make sure that it lasts for generations to come.
Well, West Michigan is known for its natural resources. Are there additional protections you believe are needed to protect our waters, our forests, and our farmlands?
Absolutely. I'm a firm believer in both the Watershed Health and Wellness Act, the PFAS Cleanup Act, things we can do to make sure that whether it's runoff issues that are contaminating waterways through algal blooms because of higher concentration of nitrogens with fertilizer, to dealing with some of the remediation that we've had from our industrial past, so that folks' well water isn't being poisoned by contaminants left over. That is something that we need to emphasize and emphasize strongly. I mean, we're a state defined by our waterways and our watersheds. We're the Great Lakes state. Although the 3rd District doesn't touch on the Great Lakes, we have to do everything we can to make sure that clean air and clean water are something that everyone in Michigan, everyone in the U.S. should be able to expect, and not luxuries available only to the few.
Well, there is groundwater, so you mentioned the watersheds, it's there.
Well, and the PFAS is where it's there too. I mean, that's the biggest issue, is that the plumes that are spreading from points of contamination. Kent County has several up in the Belmont area from the Wolverine tannery, but also from old waste deposit sites, from chrome plating, from any number of industries. And when it comes to PFAS, one of the things folks forget is that the federal government mandated, in many cases, that these industries use PFAS. Oftentimes for its flame retardant capabilities. So it's not just an issue of cleanup, it's also saying, where we have federal mandates and regulations today, what's going to be the PFAS of the future? How do we make sure that we're taking a long-term approach and not letting short-term gain get in the way of long-term harm?
Under what dire circumstance or government necessity would you be willing to support a tax increase?
I don't know that we've seen that dire circumstance yet. And, I don't want to speculate too much. I think one of the things, I'm a big believer, and one of the things we absolutely need to do is to get to the point where determining what is sort of that net requirement, right? I mean, until we get to the point where there is no more waste or duplication or inefficiency to pare down, and our government is operating in as lean a way as possible and as responsive a way as possible to deliver for the people of the U.S. the services that they should expect. I would not be comfortable with a tax increase, because I think we need to sharpen our pencils on the governmental side first. We need to make sure that we are getting transparency on current spending and aligning that with actual priorities rather than just operating off of inertia. So I don't think we should have folks throughout the U.S. paying higher taxes until the government can prove that that is ultimately necessary, and that proof is going to be a long ways off. We have a lot of room to grow in terms of finding ways to align our government more efficiently.
That's the closest I get to a trick question. That's it.
Good.
All right. There are economists who are concerned with growing wealth disparity as a threat to the country's future economic growth and prosperity. Do you concur or disagree? Explain.
I think certainly. I mean, I'm very worried right now that we've seen rising costs in the kind of three main buckets of requirements of everyday life. I mean, in healthcare, in housing, and education, we've seen those areas grow as a percentage of everyday Americans' pocketbooks multiple fold over inflation in the past 20 years. Now, one of the proposals often meted out in order to deal with inequality is rising federal and governmental intervention. And I would step back and say, well, let's look at why those costs are rising in the first place. And I don't think it's a coincidence that those are the three most heavily regulated and heavily subsidized sectors of the American economy. Again, bringing back that sense of competition, bringing back that sense of efficiency and accountability is going to be what's ultimately going to stop weighing so heavily on the pocketbooks of everyday Americans. We get to that point, and now we are better able to identify the other areas we need to address to mitigate some of that growing wealth inequality. But so much of that is less of an issue of needing mechanisms for subsidization than how do we remove the hurdles that are preventing the upward social mobility that this country is known for. That was one of the reasons why I was a passionate proponent of bringing the same veteran educational benefits that the World War II generation had back to the veterans who were coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan. You unlock that potential, you help remove the barriers that are getting in the way of someone accessing the American dream, and fantastic things are going to happen. You try to, if there's barriers in one area and you respond with adding barriers in another, you're just fixing a very unfair dynamic where it is today, rather than trying to make sure that you are having the machine that this government, this economy, this society operate in a way that the best have every opportunity to advance, and no one is being held back based on the circumstances of their birth, based on where they're born, but have every opportunity to unlock and achieve their potential.
As a nation, should we be investing in alternative energy or rely on fossil fuels securing energy independence?
We should absolutely be investing in, and I'm not even going to say alternative energy, because a lot of renewable energy sources have come to market parity with traditional kind of fossil fuels. I'm a strong proponent of an all of the above solution. I think we will always need some degree of on-demand energy generation until our battery storage technology improves significantly. So some component, ideally either nuclear or natural gas, will certainly be necessary for at least the foreseeable future. But as much as we can shift to renewables, whether wind, solar, hydro, in that interim period, the far better off we're going to be. Not only is that just an issue of carbon release and of other kind of greenhouse gas mitigation on the pollution side, but it also decentralizes our grid, allows for more localized production that's going to be more efficient, and that's going to be more resilient in the face of natural disasters or anything else. This sort of mass production in a few key nodes, that was how our system was built going back a century. A lot of that legacy infrastructure is getting pretty dated. The more we can kind of leapfrog, just replacing an outmoded system and working to build more internal resiliency and generative capacity, that's how you build the grid for the future. That's how you make sure energy production is aligned with long-term goals, rather than just a patchwork of solutions to get us for the next 5 or 10 years.
Final question. Is there a moral or personal issue you support that is in opposition to your party's ideology, What is it, and why do you strongly adhere to your belief?
I do not support the death penalty. I mean, to me, I'm proudly pro-life, and I find it just hard to justify or reconcile those two beliefs. I think we haven't seen the death penalty to be either an effective deterrent on the criminal side, and it oftentimes is, just looking at it from a strictly morally neutral standpoint, it does not have a deterrent capability, and it also is far more expensive than just life imprisonment. I struggle to find a scenario where somebody in the government's control should be put to death. I've been involved in fighting overseas. I've had to make life or death decisions. I know that I'm responsible for things that I have to carry with me. I can justify some of that because of there is a self-defense component. This is, combatants on the field of battle, rather than having to step back and say, this is somebody who is, within the government's, care. This is, someone who's done terrible, outrageous, awful things. But to me, the government should not be in a position to make that decision.
U.S. House of Representatives candidate Republican Peter Meijer, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Patrick.